February 1802. Poughkeepsie, New York. In the clerk's vault at the Dutchess County courthouse, where damp creeps up the stone and iron locks sweat, a narrow parcel lies bound in black thread. On its face a careful courthouse hand, Colter, inquest and commitments. Inside a list of items received and removed, an inventory that reads like a prayer, half learned and half feared. 1 ledger Ephraim C. 3 lengths of hair coiled on card. 2 wax glass eyes. 1 memorandum, Hudson Asylum. The ledger is gone. The hair returned to proper parties. The eyes, logged then mislaid. Only the memorandum remains, a scrap torn from a larger leaf, written in a matron's small letters as if not to wake something sleeping. Still singing lullabies to the dead. Now wind the clock back to autumn, 1799. Rural Dutchess County. Fields scored with stone walls, cider pressed and biting, night so dark the Milky Way feels like a river that forgot which way to run. On a lane near the river, a low clapboard house with a carved sign hangs from a bracket, E. Colter, U. and Undertaker in Kabit Macaire. Beneath it, smaller letters say what undertakers of the federal era were not yet expected to say. Mourning Arts by the Mrs. Colter. Wax effigies, hairwork, scripture verse in shadow frame. Within, the smell is complicated, new, plain pine from coffins, lye soap from the washstand, the sweet medicinal of orris root and wintergreen that clings to wax like a secret. On a trestle table, a face, no, the idea of a face, rises from warmed beeswax mixed with tallow, hands guided. Young hands, precise, blue, veined, unshaking. Each eyelash is placed, each curl of hair embedded, a throat is smoothed where lace will later lie. A doll, if doll is a word big enough to hold a bereaved mother's gaze. Dutchess County in the last year of the century is an old world hammering at a new. Quaker villages and Dutch farmhouses, Anglican churches and Methodist tents, a democracy learning manners it pretends it already knows. Death is domestic. Bodies are washed on the kitchen table, pinned into shrouds by the women of the house, carried to a family plot behind a stone wall. Embalming. In this place is rumor and surgery. Preserving fluid belongs to European museums, not to the Hudson Valley. Memory here is made with hair woven into wreaths, with portraits painted in miniature, with sermons that preach the good death. Ephraim Colter is praised as a pious man who makes sound coffins and says scripture without making a show of it. In his shop ledger, later cited and then sealed, he notes not just lengths and widths, but lines like, for Mrs. W., angel hairwork in frame, black ribbon, for Mr. Alden, wax imago of infant Asher, to comfort his daughters, 2 or 3, depending on who remembers. In some pages they are temperance and mercy. In others simply, the Mrs. Colter handled what their neighbors called delicate work. Their hands learned to hold what could not be held. They became famous for a thing that does not, in the telling, stay simple. Their wax effigies, faces built from description, and sometimes a lock of hair, sat in parlors where a family could not afford to keep a body on ice or in spirit. The girl's work looked too alive. The lips remained soft, cheeks never turned the gray of certainty. They made the dead bearable, an elder would later say, at a cost none of us tallied. Then, in November of 1799, Ephraim Colter dies suddenly in his yard. The coroner will write apoplexy. The minister, called home, the ledger, the one we cannot read, seized. The house does not go silent, the Mrs. Colter go on. The sign stays up. The dying of winter is a busy time, and the parlor remains ready, watered black cloth, a Bible open to Thessalonians, wax warming, lullabies when the wind runs in the eaves. 2 winters later, an eddy of talk hardens into investigation. A neighbor says the Colter girls sing to their wax babies at night. A farm wife swears the eyes in a display case followed her. A boy delivering kindling to the back door sees a white hand under a doll's veil and returns home shivering in a way his mother cannot cure with broth. The sheriff, pressed by a church elder who both admires and fears what he has seen in that parlor, visits the Colter house with a deference he thinks will be reciprocated. It isn't. The girls do not run. They do not defend. They lift a curtain. Behind the curtain, the air does not move. Behind the curtain, death has become something else. The sheriff will later say, preserved remains intermingled with effigy. A young constable will say, dolls and not dolls together. The coroner's clerk, who will be scolded into using neutral phrases, writes the note you read at the start. Still singing lullabies to the dead. This much is record after 1802, the court sealed everything. The girls were declared insane, the words then were harsher. Lunatic, unfit, unwholesome to society, and confined to an institution on the river locals called the Hudson Asylum, an almshouse and madhouse braided together in a way that made both worse. What remains unsealed is what we are about to open, not just what they did, but why. Whether the Colter daughters were monsters disguised in mourning, or the victims of a town that loved their skill until it made them afraid. But why did this happen, and why was it erased from history? Before we continue, if this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us what city or state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. Before they were the Mrs. Colter, they were Ephraim's girls, daughters of a cabinet maker who tied his trade to scripture and found a niche between art and grief. In Federal-era New York, undertakers were not yet the specialists they would become. They were joiners with a sideline in funerals. Ephraim's coffins were known for clean dovetails and a finish rubbed with beeswax and tallow until they glowed under candlelight. He arrived from somewhere south, perhaps Fishkill, perhaps farther, after the war, when men were making new names out of old wood. Dutchess County then was a quilt. Dutch families whose grandfathers carved their names into pews, English planters with marriages like treaties, Quakers with tight mouths and good hearts, and a new Methodism that sang salvation into barns. Death was familiar and, in a way, polite. Yellow fever along the river in '98 had taught the valley the quickness of departure. An ox could draw a wagon to a grave faster than a minister could finish a sermon. And so families wanted something to keep. Locks of hair were tied with ribbon and tucked into Bibles. Mourning rings with curls of the deceased's hair under glass were exchanged like sacrament. In Europe, especially in Catholic and courtly circles, wax effigies, imago met similar needs, though New York farmhouses did not care to imitate Versailles. The Colter girls changed that calculation. Whether Ephraim learned the basics from a traveling Italian waxworker or a Philadelphia anatomist's assistant who passed along recipes, no one now can say. What we do have, thanks to a minister's journal found much later, is a line. Called to Colters to see a likeness of little H. Parents comforted by an image that breathes nothing and bids them be still. The girls, with their father's instruction and their own exacting eyes, modeled faces in beeswax edged with stearin or tallow, tinted cheek and lip with carmine and onion skin tea, and anchored hair into the scalp while the wax was warm. Glass eyes from New York, or polished jet when glass was dear, gave the final mercy of gaze. It is a skill, Ephraim wrote once in a letter quoted in probate, and perhaps a temptation. You can see the line they walked. In a house where the dead lay in the next room, a wax face offered to sit still without changing, no smell, no collapse, no rough truth. For families who couldn't afford ice or a quick burial in deep winter, it was a way to hold vigil without watching loss write itself into the features you loved. The Mrs. Colter called it comfort. Others called it uncanny. All called it precise. The Colter parlor is the place everyone remembers when they speak of the case, and the room no one described the same way twice. By day it was a workshop, sunlight soft through oiled paper windows, wax warming in a copper bowl over a spirit lamp, the smell of orris and wintergreen rising with a gentleness that fooled you into breathing deep. By night it was a theater, curtains drawn, candles snuffed to coals, the girls at the table bent like seamstresses, not nurses, their mouths moving with lullabies too low to be immodest. On a sideboard under a linen, finished pieces waited, a child's face the size of a hand with lashes as fine as threshing dust, an old woman's features smoothed of the fight they held in life. The girls placed them in shadow frames with scripture. Sorrow may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Or set them on stands with lace collars, ready to receive the gaze of the bereaved. When a family could afford it, They added hairwork wreaths, hair from the deceased and from those who loved them, woven together in loops and teardrops under convex glass. Grief turned into craft you could dust. Their reputation grew in a way reputations do, when money and mystery court whispered, then spoken aloud, then nodded at in meeting. Pilgrims of sorrow came from as far away as Kingston. The Colter girls can give you your little one back long enough to say goodbye. A midwife testified, not in court but in a kitchen. Ephraim kept the ledger, counted the coins, sent some entries to charity, and wrote the names of those who couldn't pay with the gravity of a minister writing a banns. And yet, always the edge. The faces were so very lifelike. They breathe. A farmhand said once, simple as salt, not with air, but with something. A young widow, following her effigy to the door, touched a cheek and drew back. Not because it was cold, it wasn't, but because in that second the cheek felt like the kind that might turn to you. The girls smiled small smiles, the kind that say we intend comfort, not sorcery, and the town, being a town, chose not to vote on that distinction. On a Monday in November of 1799, with a frost hard enough to make wheel ruts ring, Ephraim fell where he stood near the woodpile. No blood, no cry anyone admits to hearing. He was buried with a coffin he did not make in Scripture, he did not choose. The Mrs. Colter wore black without ruffle, and a neighbor noted, approvingly, that they did not collapse in public. After Ephraim, the parlor doubled as chapel and fort. We have one witness who says he saw the girls move with a new urgency, a care sharpened by the absence of any man to stand in front of them and accept praise or blame. They accepted more work. No family turned away. One writes in a margin, and their effigies began to keep company in a way they had not when Ephraim was alive. Families took longer to collect. Some effigies waited days. Some, for reasons no one can agree upon, stayed. Lone, the ledger allegedly read beside a few entries, to comfort. Night began to stretch. 2 farm girls who did mending for the Colters told a neighbor years later that the house leaked lullabies at midnight, that gentle song used for fretful infants. It stitched the night to itself. They sing to the dolls, the neighbor said, and the dolls don't answer. God help us if they do. That winter was a sick one. A fever ran along the creek. Travel froze and thawed and froze. Ministers were snowed in. Funerals held with 4 men and a psalm. The girls took in a woman with no kin, a peddler found stiff in a hedge, and a child from a family too poor for anything but prayer. The line between effigy and body prepared for viewing blurred. Wax warmed on the same table where hands washed faces that no longer flushed. The smell of orris, so clean, so nearly floral, covered smaller smells until, as one elderly man said, we forgot what true sorrow ought to smell like. What tipped the town? Perhaps the boy with kindling, perhaps a church elder who knocked and, seeing no one, walked in, perhaps a whisper that carried across a pew like a cold draught. It was not violence that drove the sheriff to the door. It was the sense that the Colter house had become a place where grief crossed a line decorum could not name. When the sheriff came, with a young constable and the church elder, not one of them became a hero in the telling. We asked to see. The sheriff later wrote, what was hidden, temperance or mercy, the names drift like smoke, did not play at ignorance. She lifted a curtain between parlor and back room, and the men stepped into air that had been still a very long time. It was tidy. That's the first thing they said, because the second felt like blasphemy. On stands cordoned with lace were effigies, wax faces, scripture frames, hairwork wreaths, all the art the town had sanctioned and paid for. Interleaved in that tableau were bodies, preserved, dressed, arranged with a care both domestic and surgical. A child asleep in a cradle where wax would have lain. A man propped as if receiving condolence, the blue veins at his temples blanched by something not nature. A woman with flowers stitched into her hair. How? The elder asked, then, in a voice smaller than the room allowed. The answers, if answers, live in the marginalia of the time. Early American handbooks, the kind physicians turned to when they could not find a European copy fast enough, offered recipes, spirits of wines, ethanol, camphor, arsenical powders used to kill vermin and, when diluted and brushed under skin, to keep something from moving through it. Beeswax sealed lips and nostrils. Orris and wintergreen masked what no one admitted aloud. The Colter girls were not surgeons. They were precise. Sometimes precision is a kind of miracle. Sometimes it is a kind of crime. On a shelf, the sheriff noted, were glass eyes and pins. In a drawer, locks of hair labeled in careful script. In a corner, a cradle with a Lennon pinned over it, and the low note of a lullaby that the constable never forgot. The girls looked not proud and not ashamed. They looked like women at a task. The coroner was cold. The elder prayed. The sheriff wrote, "Remains preserved without license," a phrase that made him feel like a magistrate and not a man with bile in his throat. The girls were taken from their house with neighbors watching from behind curtains, and the house was sealed. In the weeks that followed, ministers preached funerals for some whose second rites they chose to consider first. Families retrieved locks of hair and recoiled from faces that would never change again. And then, just as the town's talk warmed to the heat of certainty, the law took the papers off the table. In 1802, the county sealed the full report. The only note we have from where the girls went next says it all by trying to say very little. Still singing lullabies to the dead. What happened in that house is a fact. Why it happened remains an argument, one complicated by documents that behave like fog and by the early republic's habit of calling women mad when their work made men uneasy. Theory 1: compassion turned compulsion. In this reading, the Colter daughters did not hunt for bodies. They did not kill. They did what they had been praised for doing. Comforted the living, until the tools that made comfort possible turned into habits they could not drop. Winter kept families from collecting remains quickly. Poverty kept them from keeping vigil. The girls accepted the unclaimed, preserved them to prevent what ministers call indignity of decay, and kept them longer than any custom allowed, because to bury was to end, and they had learned to keep. Lullabies are not a murderess's song, they are a nurse's. The crime here, then, was not homicide. It was an offense to a new American line between private grief and public display, a trespass that the law could only name lunacy, because the dictionary had not yet invented obsession. What supports it? There are no charges in the docket that read poison, strangulation, assault. The missing ledger. If testimony is trusted, records coin from the living, not profit from the dead. The number of discovered remains exceeds any plausible count of customers the girls would have had in a town this small. Many were travelers and paupers. The girls, according to a matron, spoke to them as if waiting for someone to claim them still. Theory 2: fraud and substitution. Here the sweetness curdles. The Mrs. Colter offered wax effigies to poor families, but wax is dear and time dearer. They instead used the bodies themselves, washed, brushed, pinned, preserved, and displayed them as dolls, at a lower cost, counting on candlelight and the kindness of wishful seeing to carry families through their hour. Effigies intermingled with remains because in this shop, at this profit point, the line was not moral but economic. They did it for money. Lullabies are not a comfort here, they're theater. What supports it hints in the ledger. Loan. That might be repayment of a thing not delivered. Tool marks observed by the coroner's clerk never preserved, but paraphrased later pins in places an imitation would need. Not a body. The quiet rise of the Colters' household goods after Ephraim's death, without new furniture built, suggesting cash flow from something other than coffins. Theory 3. Resurrectionists who lost the nerve. In Philadelphia and New York, physicians paid for cadavers long before the public agreed to that commerce. Resurrection men stole bodies from graveyards. Poorhouses supplied others for coin. If you place the Colter house between a medical man's need and a winter that kept the river passable, you can imagine a trade. The girls preserved those the doctors did not arrive in time to collect. The wall between anatomy and mourning art went thin, but then, whether by conscience caution or quarantine, the buyers stopped showing. The girls kept what they had prepped to move on. What supports it? Recipes for preserving fluids in Ephraim's papers would not have been needed for effigies. Glass eyes and delicate pins could be misdirection. We have a single mention. In a surgeon's notebook in Albany in 1801, a party on the Hudson who keep specimens, imprudent, conspiracy or reach. With the report sealed, we can only triangulate. Theory 4, the father shadow and the daughter scapegoat. It is convenient that Ephraim died before the discovery. It is convenient that the Mrs. Colter carry the blame. A carpenter undertaker interfacing with physicians in grief is a man who might have seen an opportunity. After his death, the girls continued the system they had been made to build. When it collapsed into scandal, the town wrote the story it could live with, not a respected man skirting sin, but women, always already labeled delicate, falling into disorder. What supports of bills of lading for orris, camphor, and spirit purchased in Ephraim's name before his death, hair work and effigy orders in the girl's careful script, payments to itinerant laborers noted in a masculine hand for removal, and the speed with which the church elder became prosecutor rather than penitent suggests power was shielding power behind the word lunacy. Theory 5, the legend grew teeth. Skeptics remind us early America loved a lurid tale. Wax effigies were real, so were hairwork and umago. The discovery, should we even call it discovery, could have been a single preserved body kept too long out of compassion that became 30 dolls in a century of retelling. The asylum's note, still singing lullabies to the dead, is small and can be interpreted as a comfort given to a grieving patient, not a confession of depravity. If the county sealed the report, it might be because the case embarrassed respectable families who had ordered effigies, not because it revealed a crime. What supports it? Absent numbers, absent photos, absent anything but descriptions designed to move a parish to shock. The sealed file itself attracts legends like a pond attracts midges, and yet, even skeptics cannot explain away the multiple attestations to faces and not faces, the glass eyes in the inventory, the minister's journal entry in which he writes, "We must find a better word for sorrow than," the records called it misfortune. The locals whispered something else entirely. After the court sealed the file in 1802, the Colter name faded from receipts and reappeared as a cautionary against romancing the dead. The house was auctioned. A man with no patience for ghosts tore down the parlor curtains and used the back room for barley sacks. He told anyone who asked that he never heard singing there, not once. His wife told no one that some nights, when the wind came off the river, the house smelled faintly of orris and tallow, and she lulled their infant with a tune she could not place. The Hudson Asylum, if we grant it that name, was not a hospital as you understand one now. It was an almshouse with locks, a refuge that could be punishment if you were poor and female and inconvenient. The surviving memorandum is cruel in its vagueness. Still singing lullabies to the dead. Singular, plural, which sister or both. It does not say, admissions were by commitment, discharge by goodwill. A daughter could become a case and never leave. By mid-century, the fashion for mourning evolved without them. The Civil War would make embalming modern and public. Photographs of the dead would sit on mantels, hairwork would flourish and then curdle into quaintness. The Colter girls' art, even if all rumor and no crime, would be repackaged as Victorian curiosity. In Dutchess County, a lane near the old foundation was, for a while, called Dole's Road by children who did not know why their grandmothers flinched, and then smiled when they said it. The lasting question this story asks is not about wax. It is about the line, the one you and I draw, often without knowing it, between honoring the dead and using them. The Colter daughter's hands behaved with more reverence than many surgeons did in those days. The problem was not care. It was control. Who decides what happens to a body when kin are absent? When money is short, when winter is long? Who decides what comfort is for the living, and when comfort becomes a private theater of denial? There is also an uglier question, one that repeats in too many eras to call it an aberration. What do communities do with women whose intimate work is indispensable until it makes men uncomfortable? The court's solution? Declare them mad, seal the paper, and move on. Kept Sunday mornings tidy and history hungry. If the ledger survived, perhaps it would show kindnesses alongside misjudgments. If the girls had been brothers, perhaps the narrative would remember them as innovators of preservation, not as a cautionary under glass. You can walk near where the Colter house stood. The maps have moved on, but the ground has a kind of memory. Locals claim that in September, when apples sweeten and the air remembers both blossom and frost, you catch a whiff of wintergreen under the smell of wood smoke, and for a second you cannot tell whether your griefs are present or preserved. A farmer once told an interviewer, "I think they kept those people so they wouldn't be alone." Maybe that is a sin. Maybe it is kindness misapplied. Either way, we made a bad story out of it so we wouldn't have to ask what we would do if it were our child, our winter, our house. Perhaps the truth still lies hidden in that sealed packet with the knot of black thread, in a minister's full journal kept by a great-granddaughter in a trunk she won't open, in the unclaimed corner of a churchyard where 2 stones were once ordered and never set. Or perhaps what's left is that small, ghastly, tender sentence in the asylum's hand, still singing lullabies to the dead. It reads like indictment. It reads like prayer. We end where the paper refuses to begin with a room that held too much sorrow, and a town that declared the women inside it insane, rather than learn a new word for grief. A sign that said, "Mourning Arts," a cradle in a back room, a curtain lifted, glass eyes on a shelf, locks of hair labeled in careful script, and a note smuggled out of an institution on the river that tried to make accountability small by making language smaller. Still singing lullabies to the dead. Which theory makes the most sense to you? Were the Colter daughters caretakers who carried compassion across a line they couldn't see? Were they frauds who found profit in candlelit confusion? Were they part of a grim economy feeding cadavers to distant lecture halls, their parlor a mask until their buyers vanished? Or were they scapegoats for a father's enterprise and a town's fear? Women turned into vessels for shame so men could keep their pews. Tell us in the comments, what detail disturbed you the most? The wax faces under scripture, the tidy room with dolls and not dolls together, or that asylum note that sounded too much like a hymn? And if you're listening from the Hudson Valley, or anywhere grief has been turned into art, what have your elders whispered about mourning that the history books never mention? If this episode held you, tap like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. Share this with someone who thinks the past kept its rules. It didn't. It kept its secrets. And in our next episode, we'll travel to 1838, Kentucky, where a clapboard house on a bend in the road acquired a reputation the mail coach couldn't outrun. They called it the mourning house, because even after every death inside was accounted for, the knocker kept lifting, the parlor rug kept wearing thin, and the ledger by the door kept filling with names of guests no one remembered inviting. You won't want to miss it.